Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Linguists in Hollywood. Ooh, yay! My name is Michal Temkin-Martinez, and I'm a professor and chair of the Linguistics department here at Boise State. And tonight I have the distinct pleasure of serving as your host. I'll also be the moderator of the interview with Marc Okrand, creator of Klingon, and Paul Frommer, creator of Avatar. This is our third time hosting Linguists in Hollywood. The first one was in 2011, and the second in 2018. And we're so excited to get to introduce Paul and Marc to a new set of students and audience members. With us here tonight, we have students in our University Foundations course on how to make a language. Yay. We have honor students, and of course, students in the linguistics courses and the linguistics major and minor. We also have linguistics alumni, along with supporters and donors and friends of the department joining us here in person and through our online streaming. And of course, we're very excited to have members of the community join us as well. So thank you all. Before we get started, I'd like to thank a few folks so that I don't forget to do it once we close out the event. So first and foremost, thank you to our linguistics students, staff, and faculty for helping take care of lots of details today and as we prepared for our event today. Thank you also to our co-hosts, the Conlanging Club. The Conlanging Club is a student organization that's dedicated to conlangs, or constructed languages, like Klingon and Na'vi. And the Conlanging Club is in its second year this year, and it meets weekly on Thursdays at noon. So look them up on campus groups and join them. We also have a few co-sponsors for the event. The University Foundations program is one of the sponsors, along with several entities in the College of Arts and Sciences, including the School of the Arts and the Humanities and Social Sciences Initiative. Finally, I'd like to thank a few individuals and groups who have helped us in promoting our event. So first, an alumna linguistics minor, Jenny Monska, designed our beautiful marquee design in 2011. And we've been able to use it since, and we're very grateful for that. And then we have the communications team from the College of Arts and Sciences, Nick and Dana. And we got some great media coverage, Joel Haruma from local KBOI, and the talented Idaho Matters team at Boise State Public Radio, who helped get the word out to the community before the event. Finally, our event tonight is produced by the exceptional team at University Television Productions, directed by Nathaniel Snyder, and supported by the events team here at the Student Union Building. And I'd like to give a last shout out to our AV Tech tonight, Cooper, who's actually a linguistics minor, so yay. Okay, I think we're ready to bring out our guests, so please welcome Marc Okrand and Paul Frommer to the stage. Marc and Paul both have PhDs in linguistics and have worked as creators of constructed languages, or conlangs, in Hollywood. So Marc is most well known for creating Klingon for the Star Trek movies and TV series, but has also worked on several other languages. And Paul is most well known for creating the language Na'vi for the Avatar movies. And the third one is actually coming out this December, so we're very excited about that. Both of our guests have long careers outside of Hollywood as well. Prior to their retirement, Paul is a professor of business communications at USC's Marshall School of Marshall Business School. And Marc as director of the captioning, of live captioning at the National Captioning Institute. So tonight we'll start the interview with some questions that we've prepared ahead of time, but we're also interested to hear from audience as well. So you should have gotten an index card. Hopefully you have a pen. So if you're interested in asking a question, write down a question. Try to be as legible as possible, and pass it to your left. On the left we have the entire linguistics department. So if you pass your questions to the left, they will pass it down to the front, and we will get the questions asked by my colleague Daniel Sanford. I think we're ready to get started. Let's start. I have to sit down first, I know. Okay. All right, so our first question is sort of the obvious one. How did you get started in Hollywood? How does one get started in Hollywood?
First of all, Michal, thanks very much for setting this up. It's really great to be here, and thank you all for coming. This is just a real joy being here. So my story goes back 20 years. I can't believe it was in 2005. And at that time, I was at the University of Southern California, and James Cameron's production company, Lightstorm Entertainment, had sent an email to the USC Linguistics Department, I think also UCLA, looking for a linguist who could develop a new language for a science fiction film. We didn't know it was called Avatar. The code name, I think, was Project 880. Now, I would never have seen that email because although my degree is from the linguistics department, I was actually teaching in the business school. But through a great stroke of luck, a good friend of mine and colleague and mentor in the linguistics department, Ed Finnegan, saw the email and forwarded it to me. He said, "Paul, this looks like you." And so I said, "Oh yeah, I really want that." And so I essentially applied for the job. I wrote a very enthusiastic letter to James Cameron. I also sent him a copy of the linguistics workbook that Ed and I had co-authored. It's called Looking at Languages. It's essentially a book of problems for students in an introductory linguistics class. One of the problems that I had developed, fortuitously, was a problem on Klingon. I had learned just enough Klingon to be able to put together an exercise for students, and so I pointed it out to Cameron and said, "Hey, see, I know something about constructed languages." Anyway, I was called into his private office in Santa Monica, spent an incredible 90 minutes with him when he told me about his vision for the film and what he wanted for the language. Apparently went well. He stood up, shook hands, and he said, "Welcome aboard." And my life has not been the same ever since. So that's my origin story.
Nice. Thank you, Paul. Mark?
So my origin story for Klingon is I was asked to do Klingon because 2 years before that, I did Vulcan. So the real question is, how did I get to do Vulcan? I happened to be in Los Angeles for captioning reasons and had time on my hands that I hadn't counted on. Got on the phone, called up friends, and one friend said, "Come by for lunch." Okay. She meant come by for lunch where she worked, and she worked at Paramount Pictures. Her boss was Harv Bennett, who was the executive producer of Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, second Star Trek movie. And I knew him too. So I knew I had two friends working on Star Trek. I had no information beyond that. So we're sitting around having lunch with another woman who was working on the film. And the woman who I hadn't known before said, "I understand you have a degree in linguistics." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, that's very interesting. We've been talking to people at the linguistics department at UCLA recently." I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, there's a scene in the film in Star Trek II where Mr. Spock, right, Vulcan, talks with another Vulcan, a new character named Savik. And when they filmed the scene, the actors were speaking in English because the script said to speak in English. But now that we're in post-production, we're editing the thing, everyone thinks it would be better if they were speaking Vulcan. So we got the idea of hiring someone from UCLA, a linguist from UCLA, to come over, look at the scene, look at their lips, see what they said, and make up gibberish that, when pronounced, would match the lip movements of the English, and then we would put in subtitles. And I said, that's very clever, to do something like that. And hiring a linguist makes sense, because linguists understand what you do with your mouth to make different kinds of noises. And she said, yeah, we thought it was a good idea too, but it's turned into a headache. This was in 1982, which is long enough ago that I don't remember why it was a headache. But it wasn't working out for whatever reason. And she said, I don't know what we're going to do. This has to be taken care of right away. And I said, what do you mean right away? It's got to be done by the end of this week, which is exactly how long I was in town. And I said, I can do that. Because as she was telling me about it, I was thinking about how I would go about doing it if I were going to be the person who did it, although I didn't think I was going to be that person. At that point, the associate producer of the movie happened to walk by. They turned to him and said, we just solved the Vulcan problem. They told him about who I was and stuff, and he said, come see me after lunch. That's how I got involved. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's great. I love hearing the origin stories in that way. Another thing I like to hear is people's origin stories of how they picked what they picked as their major. What made you guys pick linguistics as your major? You both have PhDs in linguistics. Did you have an undergraduate degree in linguistics as well? And how did you find linguistics, I guess, maybe?
Well, I came to linguistics through a rather circuitous route. I've been kind of like this rather than like this. I knew exactly what I wanted to be when I was 8 years old, and that was an astronomer. And so when I applied to college, University of Rochester in New York State, I went there because I could major in astrophysics, which I did. I actually wound up with a degree in math, but I never took a linguistics course at all. And then I graduated in 1965, really not knowing what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, but I made one of the best decisions that I ever did, which was to join the US Peace Corps. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was sent to Malaysia. And I wound up in a very rural part of the country, a state called Terengganu on the east coast of the Malay Peninsula, and my assignment was to be a teacher. And everyone in our group knew that we were going to be teaching, but everyone expected to be teaching in an English language school, because at that time, there was virtually no secondary education in the Malay language. It was all in English. Well, it turns out that they needed a math teacher to teach in a Malay medium high school. And I had done well in the language training, which was for all of 3 months on the island of Hawaii. So now I'm in Malaysia, and I'm being sent to my assignment to the school. No one told me what the school was like, so I'm meeting with the headmaster a few days before the school year was to begin. And of course, he spoke very good English, and we were speaking in English. And then he said, how is your Malay? And I said, well, you know, I've had a few hours every day for the last 3 months. And I said, why do you ask? And he said, why do I ask? You don't realize that this is a Malay medium school, and the day after tomorrow, you're going to walk into a 7th grade classroom and speak Malay to the students. And I said, no one ever told me that. So it was, you know, trial by fire. But I plunged into it, and it actually turned out to work pretty well. And actually, by the end of 2 years there, I felt I could teach geometry and algebra in Malay pretty much as well as I could in English. So that kind of gave me the idea that maybe whatever talents I had might lie in the area of language. And I had studied a number of languages up to then, some Hebrew. I had Latin in junior high and high school. I had some French, tried to learn a little German, tried a little Arabic on my own. So I already had an interest in language, but in 1971, I applied to graduate school in linguistics, and I wound up going to USC, and I've been very happy with that choice.
Thank you. Mark?
So I never heard of linguistics when I entered college. I went to undergraduate school at the University of California in Santa Cruz, which at the time I went was a brand new campus, brand new school. I was there the second year of its existence. And all of the students in the part of the university that I went to had to take a course together. And the name of the course was Language, Culture, and Society, or maybe Language, Society, and Culture. It was something like that. And what it turned out to be was an introduction to the faculty and an introduction to the disciplines, because each week the lectures would be given by a different faculty member from a different discipline. So one week it was a philosopher, and one week it was a literature person, one week it was a psychologist, one week it was a whatever I didn't say, the other things, yeah. All talking about language as a common theme, but from a different point of view. The person who talked about it in a way that appealed to me, that kind of grabbed me the most, was the linguist. There was only one linguist on campus at the time. So when all this was over, I said, this is pretty interesting. I never heard language talked about in this way. So I took Linguistics 1, or whatever number it was, and that was cool. So I took Linguistics 2, and that was good. Then summer came. Came back after summer, and this brand new school already revised the entire linguistics program. And Linguistics 3 didn't exist anymore. It was combined with Linguistics 2, but I couldn't take Linguistics 2 over again. So what they did is they set up a special course with just me and the professor. So here I was, a sophomore in college with a one-on-one meeting with the linguistics professor, going through the teaching materials, for linguistics, but also real linguistic data that he had. That no one had ever worked on before, or ever worked on past a certain point before. So I was doing real stuff, and that's how I got hooked. This is fun, this is interesting, and this is real. So.
Right, yeah, that experience getting real language data. I think that gets got a lot of us into linguistics, is actually thinking about language and trying to, seeing the puzzle pieces, right? Yeah, definitely. Well, related to that course, right, on language, culture, and society, we know as linguists that, language and culture are interrelated. They really influence one another. So thinking about the constructed languages that you've come up with, how has that belief of language and culture being interrelated affected the way that you constructed your languages? Sure.
Well, for the little bit of Vulcan, it didn't at all, because that's just gobbledygook gibberish for that movie. For Klingon, the culture was already there. I didn't have to create it. It was already there. It was a little bit in the original TV series in the 1960s, and it was in the script that I read, for Star Trek 3. So in coming up with the language, I said, okay, I know a little bit about these people, so the language has to fit in with them somehow. I couldn't really control the vocabulary because they had to say what the script said they were going to talk about. But I could control kind of the delivery of the meaning of the things. So the Klingons were tough and mean and brusque, so their language is tough and mean and brusque. It all fit together. So it did influence the formation of the language, definitely, knowing what these folks are all about. It wouldn't be the same if someone said, here, there's aliens from outer space make up a language, end of instructions. That would be a very different thing.
Right, and earlier this week we had an interview on Boise State Public Radio, and the first question that Mark was asked was, how would you say hello in Klingon? And the answer is?
Klingon wouldn't say hello. But when I was working on the film, on Star Trek 3, I was on the set when the Klingons were there. People kept coming up to me, the crew kept coming, not the crew of the Enterprise, the crew of the movie-making crew, would come up to me and say, oh, you're the language guy, yeah, say something in Klingon. And I say, what should I say? And they'd always say hello, how are you? I said, a Klingon would never say that, ha, ha, ha. And I got tired of giving that answer all the time, so I just said I should come up with some kind of a Klingon-y greeting. So there's no way in Klingon still to say hello. What you say instead is nuknech, which means what do you want? Yeah.
I love that. Paul?
So for a Na'vi, of course, I'm constructing the language for a very defined race on Pandora, and I had to understand their culture, their environment, and also actually their physiology. For example, I early became aware that the Na'vi, you've probably all seen the movie, they're like 9 feet tall and blue and very interesting, with tails. But they have 4 digits on each hand rather than 5. And so it immediately occurred to me, probably their counting system is not decimal, it's probably octal. And so I asked Jim Cameron about that, and he said, oh, absolutely, base it on 8. So in Na'vi, you count au, mune, e, tsing, mr, pukap, kina, vol, that's 8. And then 9 is volau, 8 and 1. And 10 is vomun, 8 and 2, and so on. So that part of the language reflected kind of who they were physically. But of course, it also had to reflect their environment. The obvious thing is that you need the vocabulary for different plants and different animals in the environment, but also for things that are important to the Na'vi and things that are not important to them. One thing that Jim Cameron said, I think it's in the movie somewhere, is that they don't have a word for lie. And so I didn't come up with a word for lie. They also, they are rather ceremonial people. And so there's this I see you thing, and that's an iconic phrase. So I had to figure out exactly how to say that and make it memorable. There are also actual ceremonies. And for the ceremony, initiation ceremonies, that kind of thing, I constructed what linguists call a different register of the language. So certain words change if you're in a very ceremonial mode. So for example, the normal word for you is nga, spelled N-G-A, but in ceremonial use it's ngenga, and the verbs change and so on and so forth. So those are just some of the ways in which the culture and the environment affected the development of the language.
That's great. I love that example, and those of you who are in UF 120, register, think about it. I also really appreciated it in Avatar that there was, because I'm trying not to have any spoilers, but also it's been a while since I've seen it, so I'm sorry if I ruin any of the movie to you. But the humans were trying to learn Na'vi, right? And there was a lot of sort of intentional teaching of Na'vi culture and Na'vi language. So I really appreciated that because I felt like that really gave the audience, or me as a viewer, the ability to understand, like, oh yes, this is my culture, and that's why in my language this is what I say. And I think that's not normal necessarily in the movies, that that you get to actually nerd out on the language piece as an audience member, and it was really neat to me as an audience member. I really enjoyed that piece, so that was really cool. In human speech communities, the speakers of the language, or the users of the language, are the rightful owners of a language. And I'm wondering, who owns conlangs? Like, who owns the languages that you created?
Yeah, well, that's kind of a fraught question. Yeah, and I mean, who owns the language? Who owns English? Well, we do, because we speak the language as part of us, right? Or whatever other languages we speak. I'm not really up on the legalities of the situation, but basically, when I created Na'vi, it was in the guise of what I think is called work made for hire, which means it's very similar to actually creating a physical product. Okay, so I was contracted to create a language. I did, and at the end of that, I said, okay, here it is. I wrote it up, did everything that was necessary, and now, presumably they own it. I was compensated for it, and that's it. So I don't have any rights to the language, in that if I wanted to write a book on Na'vi, I would need permission from, I'm not sure it's Lightstorm Entertainment or Disney, but it still remains an interesting question. I know, Mark, you have more to say about this, about they can own the lines, they can own part of the script, but can you own a word? So that it still remains kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, it's undecided. There are, because people ask me all the time, do you own Klingon? No, I don't own Klingon. Does Paramount own Klingon? No, I don't think Paramount owns Klingon. I think nobody owns Klingon, but that's my opinion. That's not a legal declaration or anything. There was, and it goes on and on and on, so I'm not going to do it now, but there was almost a court case about the ownership of Klingon. Whether it can be owned by anybody or it can be copyrighted by anybody or not. Paramount felt that it could. But the whole thing got settled out of court before the decision actually got made. So the real answer is, can you copyright a language? Can you own a language?
You know, I think in both cases, both for Klingon and for Na'vi, there are some communities of speakers out there, right? Not the actors, but you know, others who are speaking the languages, who are really interested in the languages. So how does the community play a role in the development of the language?
Well, I mean, if I had to probably point out the thing that has been most satisfying to me about the whole Na'vi experience, it's the fact that a community has developed, independently of me, who have embraced the language to the point where they use it for real communication. They actually make it part of themselves. As I mentioned several times today, I receive emails written entirely in Na'vi, which is quite familiar. And people are using it in extraordinarily creative ways. They're writing poetry, writing short stories, they're writing songs translated, you know, Christmas carols translated into Na'vi. It's really quite wonderful. And I've also realized that the people who are so involved in it, it'd be nice if they had kind of a sense of more involvement. So what I mean by that is, early on, after I realized there was a community that had developed, people began asking for new words. Now, obviously, when the movie came out, I had done enough of the language to meet the needs of the movie, but there's still an awful lot more vocabulary that should be added to the language. And so they would ask me, they would request, Paul, can you have a word for this, for this, for this? And I would try to accommodate their request. But soon after that, I realized that there were enough people out there who knew the language so well that they could actually come up with words that would actually fit the language and potentially be part of the language. And so at this point, rather than simply getting requests for new vocabulary, I also get suggestions. And there's a whole mechanism that is set up for this, which I had nothing to do with. It's called the LEP, the Lexical Expansion Project. And there's a rotating chair of the committee and so on. And every so often I get a document where suggestions for new vocabulary are sort of filtered through the committee and conveyed to me. It's done anonymously, so I don't know which particular individual suggested which new word. And I have one of three choices. I can say, I love it. This is part of the language. See, at this point, I'm the only gatekeeper. I'm the only one who could officially say, this is in, this is not. And I have a blog, and I publish new vocabulary every so often on the blog. So I can say, this is a great word, it's in. I can say, it's going in the right direction, I'd like to tweak it a little bit. Or I can say, I'd rather do it in a different way. But anyway, at this point, a certain part of the vocabulary actually comes from the community, and I think people kind of tend to appreciate that. Yeah.
When I originally did Klingon, the vocabulary that I made up was what was needed for the movie, and nothing more. Okay, if there was a line in the script that meant whatever, I made up appropriate vocabulary for that. I made up a lot more than what actually ended up in the movie, because when you make a movie, there's editing and cutting all over the place. But anything, all that was made up came from the script, whether it ended up in the film or not. I decided for better or worse, I keep questioning whether this was a good idea, to write a book about all this, because it created all kinds of issues afterwards. And I did. It's called the Klingon Dictionary, and I included all the words that I made up for the movie, whether they ended up in the film or not. That was an incredibly skinny book. So I added more Star Trek words. I went back to the original series and looked at the episodes where the Klingons were there and put in vocabulary that would fit in with that. It was still a skinny book. So I added some very general stuff, okay, and the book came out. But it was still, the vocabulary skewed towards Star Trek, outer space, that kind of thing. A lot of years later, after some people started kind of picked up on the language after the book came out. People bought it, wow, and studied it a lot, and you know, analyzed it and compiled a list of typos and all these things. A company in the UK that produces language learning CDs or CD-ROMs or something for all kinds of languages, decided they wanted to do one for Klingon. All of their language thing, all their courses are the same in terms of what the vocabulary is. Okay, so if you're taking the French one, or you're taking the Swahili one, or you're taking the Navajo one, or whatever it is, the same words are on there with the same little pictures and all this kind of thing. So they did that for Klingon. And I got this thing, and I'm thinking, now if I want to go to France, I'll get one of these things so I can learn French, so I can go to France and talk about the things you need to talk about in France. But for Klingon, why am I going to buy that? Am I going to go visit the Klingon planet? And if I do, why am I learning all the words that are good for talking about things in France? Right? I said, this doesn't make any sense, but they said, we want to do it anyway. Okay, so I did it. I had to come up with a Klingon word for mango and all these things. And when it came out, I was wondering what the Klingon-speaking community would think about this thing. They loved it. And the reason they loved it is because they said, now we can talk about everyday things. Now we can carry on a real conversation and talk about it. And from that point forward, the growth of the language, and it's grown a lot. When the dictionary first came out, the publisher had a little blurb on the back of the book that said something like, learn Klingon, the fastest growing language in the universe. And I said, how can you say that? The fastest growing language, And the publisher said to me, how many words are there in Klingon? And at the time, there was maybe 1,500 or something like that, which is nothing compared to, real languages. And she said, so if you add 1 or 2 words to Klingon, that's a percentage-wise a big increase, right? So it's the fastest growing language in the universe. Well, the language has grown a lot since that initial thing. And there's some input from Star Trek, because it's still in Star Trek. It's been in other movies, it's been in other TV shows and stuff. But the growth by far has come from the Klingon-speaking community, where they want words for all kinds of things. That I'm like, why do you want to know about this? I had to come up with a way to say polynomial expression. Why? And all this stuff. So the use of we talked about this a bit. The use of the language has changed from a language of outer space aliens running around blowing up ships to a language used on Earth to talk about Earth things. Yeah.
And in the case of Navi, there was a bit of a conflict early on because there were 2 opposing camps. I guess I could call them the purists and the pragmatists. The purists said Navi is a language spoken on a moon called Pandora, and it's spoken by these people, and it should reflect only their experience and their culture and their environment. So if the Navi don't have a word for chair or table or book, we don't want those words in the language. Okay, the other camp said, hey, we want to use the language here on Earth, so yes, definitely give us those words. So it's a pragmatist who won out, and so now we do have words for things that simply do not exist on Pandora.
Yeah, and the cultural use of the language changed too. For example, we were talking about earlier that in Klingon, I said there's no way to say hello, right? And we also when I did this originally, intentionally, I said there's no way to say please, thank you, good morning, good night. None of that stuff, because they wouldn't do it. Well, some people disagreed. The speakers wanted ways to say the thing, and some of the TV people in the later TV shows wanted the Klingons to say some of these things. So, for example, and they did a little bit of research. So in one of the episodes of one of the Star Trek, I think it was Deep Space Nine, but it doesn't make any difference. They got a hold of the dictionary because Paramount bought the dictionary too. Opened it up and they wanted to say good night. So they looked up in the dictionary, how do you say good? This word maj means good. And they looked up the word for night, which is ram. So they said, okay, maj ram, good night. Problem is, maj doesn't mean good like this is a good day or this is a good ice cream, okay? Maj means, oh, good, oh boy, is what it means. So I guess when you say maj ram, you're saying, oh boy, it's night. I don't know what you're saying. But it was in the TV show, therefore it counts. So now there's a way to say good night, and by extension, there's a way to say good morning and good afternoon and all these things. In one of the episodes, they had Captain Picard say a Klingon thing, which is not subtitled, but it's clear from context that it means thank you. All right, we have to wait. You have to have a way to say thank you and so on. So it changes because it's being used by non-Klingons on Earth. Yeah.
That's really cool. And you've mentioned before that the Klingons have also sort of evolved as a race, right?
Yeah, these mean, awful Klingons, discovered something called honor, and they talk about it all the time, and have a very complex society. So the whole language thing has to support that.
That's really cool. Well, you were talking about polynomial expression needing a word in Klingon. I was thinking back to Paul's experience of teaching math in Malay, right? Can you imagine teaching math in Klingon? That would be challenging a little bit.
Polynomial expressions, you're fine.
Totally fine. Something that's been curious to me, actually before I ask the next question, if anybody has any questions, just pass them down and Daniel will pick them up. Excellent. So something that's been interesting to me, I think all of us as linguists, we look at language sort of differently from the average Joe. But I'm wondering, as creators of a language, how has that shaped the way that you think about language now? Or has it? Has it changed the way that you think about language?
I mean, I guess more than anything, when you begin to do it yourself and create a language, you realize how extraordinarily complex language really is. I mean, the things that we do every day without thinking about it really have incredible complexity to them. And when you begin to create your own system to do that, you will, I think, inevitably discover that, hey, it's not as easy as I thought. And I've done this part of the grammar, which works pretty well, and I've done this part of the grammar, which works pretty well. But wait a minute, I never really thought too much about what happens when these things intersect, and when they will collide with each other, and when they will mesh with each other. And so those are the kinds of things that really can be very eye-opening. Linguistics in a way is kind of like math. You can't learn math by simply reading a book. You've got to do it. You've got to work the problems. You've got to figure it out. And so creating a language is a little bit like working the problems and doing it for yourself. And I think it just aids your understanding tremendously.
I would say exactly the same thing. I'm not going to repeat. Yeah.
All right. So I guess I have one last question for you, and I'm trying to formulate it because it's changed a bit. I feel like this has changed a bit in Hollywood over the last. Probably just the last few years, over the last decade probably. I think there used to be this fascination with constructed languages and with aliens and with non-human, non-Earth dwelling creatures. And like space was always part of it, right? Like, oh, it's a universe, a different planet, a different moon. And I feel like now in Hollywood, there's also a fascination with indigenous languages or with languages that might be endangered or have been dormant. And I feel like there are also roles in Hollywood now for linguists who have studied those other languages or who speak those languages, right, as native speakers, as community members. And I'm just wondering what your take is on that.
I think you're right. Yeah, there's, although I'm coming to it more from the point of view of constructed languages rather than indigenous or minority languages, or whatever you want to call it. An interesting thing has happened in Hollywood, which is a big change. Prior to Klingon, and I'm not blaming Klingon or anything, but just chronologically, in most science fiction movies, TV shows and stuff, you travel all around the world, travel all around the galaxy, all around the universe, and everybody's speaking English, right? Unless they're mean, then they're speaking British English instead of American English, but you know. And that started to change, okay? And it started to change with Klingon, not because Klingon has terrific relative clauses or something like that. It's clearly because of Star Trek, but things started to change to the point that when Avatar was being promoted, okay, I got a call from the language writer for, it was the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, I forget, or New Yorker maybe. Ben Zimmerman? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And he said, James Cameron says, I don't know if you know this, James Cameron says that this new movie, Avatar, is going to have a language that's going to out-Klingon Klingon. And he said to me, what do you think about that?
And how did you answer that?
And I said, I don't know what that means. And he said, neither do I. But the point is that people were starting to think about it, about incorporating the language in a very inclusive way. And more and more and more. So it's gotten to the point now that in Hollywood, if you're going to have a group of people, whether they're outer space aliens or live in a funny place on Earth, or it's from a bunch of centuries ago or something, you're going to hire a linguist to come and work on this language, whatever it is, right? So for Star Trek, for example, they use 4 or 5 different people to make up different languages. I'm not the only one, all right? And it's absolutely consistent, and they pay lots of attention. I was telling you a story earlier. In one of the Star Trek movies, one of the J.J. Abrams movies, there's only one that has Klingon in it. And there's just a little tiny bit. And they filmed the scene with all this Klingon dialogue going on and so on. And then the editing process began, which always changes everything. And this scene was chopped up so much when they were done that the Klingon was all messed up because they would cut a sentence in the middle, or they would take the end of a sentence and put it at the beginning of another sentence. And they knew they were doing it, okay? And they knew that it didn't make any sense anymore. And they said, okay, we can deal with this in one of 3 ways. We can say, don't worry about it because who'll know? Once upon a time, you could do that. Right. Not anymore. So they said, we're not going to do that. We can film it all over again, right? That's very expensive. We're not going to do that. Or they came to me and they said, can you make up Klingon dialogue that matches the lips of what's on there and means what the new subtitles are going to say? And my initial answer was, I don't know. But they sent me the clip in some encrypted format that I'm sure the NSA could not crack. It was amazing. And I watched this, yeah, I think I can do it. But the point of all that is not that. It's that they cared enough to do it, okay? And in subsequent things. And now on the projects I'm working now, I'm still getting calls, okay, do we have this right? Is it okay, you know? So, and back before they say, oh, forget it, don't worry about it, yeah.
No, I would just confirm everything you said. And I think Mark is actually being too modest. Klingon really was the turning point. And it's a very well-constructed language, and it stands up to scrutiny. You know, a linguist can look at it and say, yes, this is a well-constructed language. Ever since, I think writers and directors and producers in Hollywood have understood that if you're going to have an alien language, you better hire a linguist to do it, because there's going to be a certain cohort in the movie audience, not particularly large, but very passionate and very vocal, and they are going to pounce on your language and tear it apart, and if it doesn't stand up, you're going to know about it, and everybody else is going to know about it too. So you know, the days of gibberish when a director can say, you know, just say anything at all, who's going to know it's a phony language, that's gone. And so I think that's a very good thing for linguistics, yeah.
That's great. Yeah,
love that. And, you know, and I'm glad that the big companies are thinking about the audience, you know, in that way, right? Like, we understand there's going to be trouble, right? We have our first audience audience-generated question, and I love this one. How often do you completely make up words out of the blue versus building off an already existing word or stem of a word?
For me, how often, I don't, compared to my percentage-wise, I don't know one or the other. But if I have to make up a new word for something, my first thing I do is say, what have I got already? Okay, that I can use to build a new thing out of putting words together or modifying the thing somehow or other, as opposed to creating something brand new. For two reasons. One is because languages work like that. And the other one is Klingon is pretty much a monosyllabic language. There's only so many possible syllables. I don't want to use them up too fast, right? So I don't want to make up a new word and then say, oh, I don't have anywhere to turn anymore. Yeah. But I do both approaches, absolutely. Yeah.
So for new Na'vi vocabulary, I thought about this, and it kind of breaks down into four categories. And I'll go from least common to most common. The least common is that you actually borrow a term. And this makes sense in certain situations. For example, the Na'vi don't have a written language. That's part of the premise of the film. And so they've never seen a book. However, they have now come into contact with the sky people, the human beings, who do have books. And so they need to talk about this object, this thing. And they don't have a word for it. So what a very normal thing to do would be to take the English word, which they've now heard, and sort of filter it through the Na'vi sound system. So the word for book is pu. There's no B, but the closest consonant is P, and so the word for book is now borrowed and filtered into a Na'vi. So that's one way. Another way is to use what we call derivational processes. So every language has ways of changing nouns into verbs and verbs into nouns. So if you have the word happy, then then there's a mechanism for constructing happiness, that sort of thing. That's another way. A third way, which is actually very useful, Marc, you were referring to this too, is to take existing elements in the language and put them together in a new way. So for example, the word for computer in Na'vi is eltu lefngap. Eltu means brain, and lefngap means metal, so it's a metal brain, sort of thing. The word for in fact is, if you break down the word, it actually comes from true, situation, and then an adverbial ending. So in fact, it's true situationally, that kind of thing. So that sort of compounding, taking existing elements, putting them together in new ways is a very useful way. And the fourth way, which is maybe the thing that people think of the most, is come up with an entirely new word, an entirely new root. And this is maybe where kind of the art comes in, because there are no rules for that. You know, it's generally a relationship where there's no relationship to the sound and the meaning. And so you just kind of play around with it and come up with a word that fits the sound system, but just seems to fit the language. Now, one thing, though, that is interesting here is that there's this concept, not only in linguistics, but in semiotics, called iconicity. And this occurs when the symbol bears something in common to the thing it references. Okay, it doesn't happen very often, but every so often you come across, like, what have I done? Oh, I think you're fine. Okay, I'll just hold it in my hand. So, like the word boom, you know, we know what it means, but boom kind of sounds like a boom. So, Na'vi may have a little bit more of this than a lot of natural languages. So, for example, the word for rough is ektu, and that kind of sounds a little bit rough to me. And the word for smooth is faui. So, The Navi community seems to like that kind of stuff. It may go a little bit further than what you have in most natural languages, but I find that kind of fun. Yeah.
You know, in Klingon, but since Klingon is a non-human language, I tried to violate the way you do that. In spoken languages here on Earth, you know, E kinds of sounds tend to be associated with littler things, and O kinds of sounds tend to be affiliated with bigger things. So the word for big in Klingon is tin, and the word for small is mach, because it's backwards. You know, yeah.
Of course, the word big in English has I in it.
But it's not biggie. Right, yes. Our next audience member question, I think would be of interest to a lot of our students in our UF 120 class. And it's, what are some common rookie mistakes that you think people might make in creating a conlang? or maybe that they should try and avoid?
A couple of things. The people starting, you know, who are just very, very new to the whole thing, my experience talking with them is they make them overly complex just because they can. They have the languages do things that are just like you can't tell the difference between this thing and this thing. So if you're carrying on a conversation, you can't hear it. It's not distinct enough. Things like that. It's, you know.
That's cool. I think sometimes even I will try to over-enunciate things and not realize that in natural speech, you're not necessarily going to hear everything that you would hear if you were very, very careful in pronouncing things. So that's something that I think people tend to overdo. Yeah.
Right, and I mean, and watching movies where the actors are actually speaking, and hearing them speak fluently it's really amazing. And this leads to our next question, which is, which actors have been especially good to work with? Who did an especially good job with the language? Yeah, no, we know to avoid that. This is being recorded, you know.
I would kind of punt that question, but it was remarkable the effort that the actors actually went to actually nail it. Now, nobody learned the language to the point where they knew the grammar and they knew the vocabulary and they could make up their own sentences. But they didn't sign on for that. It wasn't a language class. What they had to do was speak the language and make it sound convincing, make it sound that this is my language, I speak it fluently, I know how to contour a sentence to make it flow, and so on and so forth. And they were all remarkably dedicated to getting it right. And so that was very, very satisfying, actually.
Yeah, one of the actors I worked with for one of the movies, for Star Trek VI, was Christopher Plummer, right? And the first time I met him, he said, now, I want you to teach me this language, meaning his lines. You know, very well, I want to be able to say them very comfortably. He said, because this is my first language. If I have trouble speaking something, it should be English, you know, not Klingon. And I thought, that's a great approach. Good for you. No one else had said that to me.
That's really cool. That's like really like taking the character in. And
in fact, he changed one of the words because not to make it easy for him. In Klingon, well, in Star Trek, there's a great connection between Star Trek and Shakespeare. A lot of episode titles in the original series come from Shakespeare. Some of the plots even come a little bit from Shakespeare. And in Star Trek VI, there's lots of quotes from Shakespeare. And in the original script, half of them were in Klingon and half of them were in English. And as the process went along, all the Klingon ones disappeared. And the English ones remained as a part of the editing thing. But there was one that was not supposed to be in Klingon originally, but I arrived at the set one day, and the director and writer, Nick Meyer, came up to me and said, I need one more line in Klingon. Okay, what's that? And he says, to be or not to be. In Klingon grammar, there's no to be. That does not exist. And I have a or and a not, but I don't have a be. And I was not about to change that for two reasons. One is because that's not the way the language works. The other one, the dictionary says right there, there's no verb to be. So I said, what if it means to live or not to live? He said, that's fine. That's fine. You go teach Christopher Plummer. Well, the word for live is yin. I mean, I looked in the dictionary, right? It says yin. So there's a number of different ways you can do it to be or not to be, but I kind of did it down and dirty, live or live not. Okay, yin pa, yin bet, live or live not. Go to see Christopher Plummer. He says, oh, I understand you have a new line to teach me. Yes, what is it? Yin pa, yin bet. And he goes, yin? And I said, yeah, yin. He says, we need something stronger than that. Change it to something else. Ah! So I thought, what can we do? So I said, what if we say tach pach, tach bet? Yeah, tach. Tach is good. You know, I'll accept that. But the point is, tach used to be well, still is, a suffix that meant to continue doing something. So I kind of promoted it to be a verb that means to go on, to continue. So tach pach, tach bet, to go on or not to go on, to continue or not to continue, something like that. But the point is, he was so in tune with the language at that point that he wanted to make a big statement, right? And yin was just too wimpy, yeah.
That's great. One of the other questions that we have is, what was, I'm sure you've had a eureka moment of some sort, a aha moment doing this, either constructing the language or while you're on set or while you're talking to fans or while you're dealing with emails in the language that you've constructed. What would you say is like the first eureka moment or the most significant one?
I guess it was maybe when I was on set and heard some of the very good actors speaking the language, and it sounded really good to me. They just kind of nailed it, and I said, yeah, this is actually going to work. And that was really nice, yeah.
I have two. One of them has nothing to do with Klingon. There was a Walt Disney cartoon a bunch of years ago called Atlantis, the Lost Empire. And then I did the language for that, the Atlantean language. And that was in 2000 or something like that is when this thing came out. Long time ago, kind of totally forgot about it, but I watched it again pretty recently because it was the something or other's anniversary, and there was some online thing about it. And I'm listening to it and I say, wow, this language is really good. That was one moment. But the other one, which was Klingon for Star Trek III, I was invited to a preview of it before it was released in theaters in New York. And I'm sitting in the audience watching this movie with a test audience. And they were going to ask, they had questions that they had to answer when it was all over and stuff like that. And there's one line in the movie where Krug, the villain Klingon, says the Klingon equivalent of beam me up, okay, which is cho-you-chu, which just means activate the transporter beam, so beam me up. And it's there on the movie, and it's subtitled, activate the transport beam. Later on in the movie, Captain Kirk says the same line, okay? But when he says it, it's not subtitled. So I'm watching the movie, and Krug said, "Cho-you-chu," and the movie goes along, and then later on in the movie, Kirk picks up this communicator thing, and he says, no subtitles, "Cho-you-chu," and the audience explodes. I said, my God, it's working. Yeah.
Yeah, and I am reminded of one other thing that happened on the Avatar set. As I said, no one really learned the language, but there were a few vocabulary items that caught on, and the one that virtually everyone learned was the word "skaung," and "skaung" means moron, and that's in the script, and the crew in particular loved it. And so they would delight in calling you "skaung," and so that kind of gave me a sense that yeah, people are kind of really absorbing this a little bit.
We're going to wrap up with one last question, and that is there anything else you'd like to share with us? One last word to say.
Linguistics is cool. Do it. You never know what's going to result. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, human language is a miracle. And the fact that we can all communicate with each other the way we do is just really extraordinary. So let's do it more and more.
All right, wonderful, thank you. I highly endorse their last words. Thank you both so much. Let's give them both a round of applause. All right. And we're just going to go and get